Frederick Shipman was found guilty of killing 15 of his patients, making this apparently unremarkable 54-year-old GP the country's most prolific serial killer for at least 100 years.
Sorry, Doctor.
I'll come and stand where you'd like me to stand.
All right. Sorry, good of you. Is it possible for you to...
For years, they trusted him. They believed his words, his gentle assurances, his steady hands. He was the doctor who made house calls, who sat at their bedsides, who spoke with quiet confidence as he held their frail hands in his own. Mothers, fathers, grandmothers, and grandfathers, their lives placed in his care. When the end came for them, it was peaceful. Too peaceful. Their final moments were swift, slipping away in the comfort of their own homes or in his clinic, with no sign of struggle, no indication that anything was wrong. Families mourned, but they accepted the loss. Death was expected at a certain age. It was a tragedy, but never a mystery. And yet, something was happening. One by one, his patients were leaving this world faster than anyone could explain. Certificates were signed. Causes of death were recorded. Hearts simply stopped beating. There was nothing to question. Until one woman didn't go quietly. Until one signature raised doubts. Until one grieving daughter refused to let go. That was the moment the illusion shattered. The moment whispers turned into accusations. The moment investigators realized they weren't dealing with the natural order of life and death. They were looking at something calculated. Something cold. Something monstrous. How many had truly taken their last breath under his watch? How many deaths had been written off without a second thought? And the most chilling question of all, how long had he been getting away with it? Followed by a news broadcast, Dr. Harold Shipman, suspected of murdering over 200 of his patients. Harold Frederick Shipman was born on January 14, 1946, in Nottingham, England. From the outside, his early years were ordinary. He was the middle child in a working-class family, raised by strict but devoted parents. His mother, Vera, was particularly influential in his life. She saw something special in him, something that set him apart from the other children in their small community. She pushed him toward success, believing he was destined for greatness. And Harold, in return, clung to her approval, thriving under her unwavering attention. But there was something else, something that shaped him in ways no one could have predicted. Vera Shipman was diagnosed with terminal lung cancer when Harold was just a teenager. He watched, helpless, as she withered away, her body failing her day by day. But there was one thing that brought her relief, a small injection of morphine from the family doctor. The pain would vanish. The suffering would ease. For a brief moment, she seemed herself again. Then, as the disease progressed, the injections became more frequent, and the doses stronger. Harold sat by her bedside, witnessing the power of medicine, not just to heal, but to take away pain. And then, one day, she was gone. Just like that. A quiet passing, no struggle, no fight. The doctor had given her one last injection, and she had simply slipped away. For most, such an experience would be heartbreaking. For Harold Shipman, it became something else entirely. A lesson. A revelation. He went on to medical school at Leeds University, determined to become a doctor himself. Whether it was to honor his mother's memory or to chase the feeling of control he had witnessed as a boy, no one can say for certain. But one thing is clear, this was where it all began. By 1974, Shipman had earned his medical degree. He was young, ambitious, and trusted. He secured a position at a general practice in Yorkshire, building his reputation as a caring and attentive physician. Patients felt safe in his presence, believing he had their best interests at heart. But behind closed doors, something else was happening. Shipman had developed a troubling habit. He was prescribing himself powerful painkillers, opioids like pethidine, under false pretenses. He wrote fraudulent prescriptions, feeding an addiction that grew stronger with each dose. At first, it was manageable. A secret he could control. But addiction is never silent for long. In 1975, just a year into his career, his deception was uncovered. He was caught forging prescriptions, arrested, and forced to attend rehabilitation. The incident could have destroyed his career. It should have. And yet, astonishingly, it didn't. After completing rehab, Shipman was allowed to return to practicing medicine. His colleagues, his patients, everyone believed he had learned his lesson. That he was reformed. He hadn't. In fact, this was only the beginning. Over the next 2 decades, Harold Shipman became one of the most respected doctors in England. He moved to Hyde, a quiet town near Manchester, and established himself as a dedicated family physician. He was known for his compassion, for making house calls, for treating the elderly with patience and kindness. People trusted him with their lives. And they never suspected that, one by one, they were walking into the hands of a killer. Cut to black. Brief silence. Then, the sound of a phone ringing. A distressed voice speaks, "My mother, she was fine yesterday, now she's gone." It doesn't make sense. 1998, the death that exposed him. For years, they trusted him. They believed his words, his gentle assurances, his steady hands. He was the doctor who made house calls, who sat at their bedsides, who spoke with quiet confidence as he held their frail hands in his own. Mothers, fathers, grandmothers, and grandfathers, their lives placed in his care. When the end came for them, it was peaceful. Too peaceful. Their final moments were swift, slipping away in the comfort of their own homes or in his clinic, with no sign of struggle, no indication that anything was wrong. Families mourned, but they accepted the loss. Death was expected at a certain age. It was a tragedy, but never a mystery. And yet, something was happening. One by one, his patients were leaving this world faster than anyone could explain. Certificates were signed. Causes of death were recorded. Hearts simply stopped beating. There was nothing to question. Until one woman didn't go quietly. Until one signature raised doubts. Until one grieving daughter refused to let go. That was the moment the illusion shattered. The moment whispers turned into accusations. The moment investigators realized they weren't dealing with the natural order of life and death. They were looking at something calculated. Something cold. Something monstrous. How many had truly taken their last breath under his watch? How many deaths had been written off without a second thought? And the most chilling question of all, how long had he been getting away with it? For over 2 decades, Harold Shipman moved through life as a respected doctor, a trusted caregiver, a man whose presence was supposed to bring comfort. Instead, it brought death. By the late 1990s, the number of deaths under his care had reached staggering proportions. But no one had seen it, or at least, no one had been willing to believe it. A suspicious pattern emerges. One by one, his patients died. All elderly. All seemingly natural. All under Shipman's care. It wasn't just that they were dying, it was how they were dying. Many were found sitting upright in their chairs, as if they had simply dozed off. Some were found lying in bed, fully clothed, without a single sign of distress. Almost all were alone when they passed, shortly after a visit from Shipman. And most damning of all, the sheer number of deaths. Funeral directors in Hyde began noticing a disturbing pattern. One local funeral home, run by Deborah Massey and her mother, had handled the burials of far too many of Shipman's patients. They noticed something strange. The death rate among his patients was unusually high. Many of the deceased had no prior serious illness. And, strangely, many had been sitting upright when they died. It wasn't normal. It wasn't right. So why wasn't anyone questioning it? Even when the funeral home raised their concerns to local medical officials, nothing was done. Shipman, after all, was a doctor. And in Britain at the time, doctors were trusted almost without question. If he said they died naturally, then that was that. No one dared to challenge him. The victims and their families' grief. For many families, the grief was suffocating, but there was always a lingering doubt. A creeping feeling that something wasn't right. Margaret Thompson, 67 years old, had gone to Shipman for nothing more than a routine checkup. She was healthy, independent, active. And yet, just hours later, she was dead. Her daughter later recalled. Mom never showed any signs of illness. 1 minute, she was fine. The next, I got the call. Dr. Shipman said she had passed peacefully. I wanted to believe him. I really did. But something inside me just wouldn't settle. How did she go from being so full of life to gone, just like that? And she wasn't the only one. Elsie Woolham, 74, was described by her family as full of energy. She walked to the market every morning, cooked for herself, and had never been hospitalized in her life. Yet when she went to see Shipman for a simple ailment, she never came back home. Her son, Alan Woolham, later said. My mother trusted Dr. Shipman. We all did. He told us she had a stroke. That it was quick. Painless. But I kept thinking, there was nothing wrong with her before that day. How could a stroke take her like that? And then there was Bessie Perry, 80 years old. A retired schoolteacher. Widowed, but far from frail. She had a close circle of friends and a daughter who adored her. Her daughter recalled. Mom would call me every evening at 6 p.m. It was our ritual. We never missed it. One night, the phone didn't ring. The next morning, I got a call from Dr. Shipman. He said she had died in her sleep. Just like that. No warning. No goodbyes. The grief-stricken families wanted to believe it had been natural causes. After all, Harold Shipman was a doctor. How did he get away with it for so long? The answer was terrifyingly simple: he controlled every step of the process. Shipman had designed a system that made him untouchable. He was both the killer and the one who declared the cause of death. He signed his own death certificates, ensuring no one looked too closely. He frequently encouraged cremation, destroying any evidence. He falsified medical records, making it look like his victims were already sick. No autopsies. No questions. Just trust. And for over 20 years, it worked. His weapon of choice, morphine. Shipman's method was as simple as it was deadly. He didn't strangle. He didn't use a knife. Instead, he used diamorphine, pharmaceutical heroin. A lethal injection. Silent. Undetectable. Given in just the right amount, it mimicked natural death. The elderly already had weaker hearts, weaker lungs. A high dose of morphine would shut down their breathing, leading to what appeared to be a peaceful passing. It was the perfect murder weapon. And Shipman had access to an unlimited supply. The near misses, investigations that went nowhere. For years, there were hints, small signs that something was deeply wrong. And yet, every time someone came close to uncovering the truth, Shipman walked away untouched. 1998, the first investigation. By the late 1990s, suspicions were growing louder. The funeral home in Hyde had been keeping track of the deaths, and Shipman's name came up again and again. They took their concerns to a local coroner, Dr. Linda Reynolds. Alarmed by the sheer number of deaths, she took the case to Greater Manchester Police. An investigation was launched. And then, it fell apart. Police checked only a handful of medical records. They didn't question families. They didn't order exhumations. They didn't look deeper. Shipman, as always, had covered his tracks. His medical records looked clean, because he had forged them himself. With no solid evidence, police closed the investigation. And just like that, Shipman was free to kill again. Over the next few months, at least 3 more people died at his hands. Until, finally, he made one fatal mistake. The crime that ended it all, Kathleen Grundy. In June 1998, Shipman killed Kathleen Grundy, a wealthy, well-respected woman in Hyde. But this time, he didn't just take her life. He took her money. When her daughter, Angela Woodruff, discovered a forged will, leaving everything to Shipman, she knew, beyond a doubt, that something was terribly wrong. She reported it. And this time, police didn't stop at just checking records. They dug up the body. And when they did, they found the morphine. Harold Shipman's killing spree was over. How Shipman responded to the accusations. The full scale of his crimes, how many victims there really were. The trial that shook the UK medical system. His chilling lack of remorse. And the shocking way he met his own end. Stay tuned. Because the most chilling part of this story is still to come. For over 20 years, Harold Shipman had built an empire of death. Hundreds of patients, gone. One signature on a death certificate, and any trace of suspicion vanished. No one questioned the doctor. No one dared to believe that the man meant to save lives could be the one taking them. But in the summer of 1998, he made one fatal mistake. And it brought everything crashing down. Kathleen Grundy, the murder that caught him. Kathleen Grundy was 81 years old. A former mayor of Hyde, she was well-respected, independent, and in excellent health. Unlike many of Shipman's other victims, she wasn't frail. She wasn't bedridden. She was still active in her community, a woman who had many years ahead of her. So when she suddenly died on June 24, 1998, it didn't make sense. Her daughter, Angela Woodruff, was devastated. But grief quickly turned into suspicion. Because Kathleen's death wasn't the only shock. Shipman's fatal mistake, the forged will. Days after her mother's passing, Angela received an official letter. Inside was a will. A document allegedly written by her mother. But it wasn't just a will, it was a total rewrite of her mother's estate. It stated that Kathleen Grundy's entire fortune, over £386,000, around $600,000 at the time, was to be left to Harold Shipman. Angela was stunned. Her mother had always been meticulous about legal matters. And she would never have left everything to a doctor she barely knew. Angela immediately contacted the police. She wasn't just questioning the will. She was questioning her mother's death itself. Because if Shipman had lied about the will, what else had he lied about? The investigation begins, exhuming the body. Angela's suspicions led police to do something that had never been done before. They exhumed Kathleen Grundy's body. Buried for only a few weeks, her remains were still intact, and could be tested. When the toxicology results came back, the findings were undeniable. Kathleen Grundy had been injected with a lethal dose of diamorphine. Pharmaceutical heroin, the same drug Shipman used on all his victims. And just like that, his perfect crime was no longer perfect. The doctor who had spent decades covering his tracks, had finally left a trail. The arrest, the investigation unravels a monster. On September 7, 1998, Harold Shipman was arrested at his home in Hyde. The man who had walked free for over 20 years now sat in a cold interrogation room. But this was just the beginning. Because as investigators started pulling at the threads of Shipman's crimes, what they uncovered was a nightmare. At first, police focused only on Kathleen Grundy. But as they searched his records, they found something that chilled them to the core. A pattern. A trail of death that stretched back decades. They began reviewing the deaths of other patients. And one by one, the pieces fell into place. Hundreds of elderly patients, dead. Most had Shipman's signature on their death certificates. Dozens had been cremated before families could ask questions. Many had medical records altered after their deaths, to make it look like they had been sick. Shipman had left just enough evidence to bury himself. And when police searched his computer, they found his final mistake. The fake medical records, the smoking gun. Shipman had been meticulous. He knew that for his crimes to work, he had to make sure the deaths looked natural. So, after each murder, he would go back into the medical records, and rewrite history. He would add fake illnesses to a patient's file after they had already died. But there was one crucial flaw in his plan. His computer system logged every edit. Every time he changed a file, it recorded the exact date and time of the modification. And the police had it all. They could see him altering records, after the patient had died. It was concrete proof that he was lying. That he had killed them. The trial of Harold Shipman, 1999 to 2000. By October 1999, Shipman was charged with 15 counts of murder. The trial was one of the most shocking in British history. The evidence was overwhelming. The forged will. The toxicology report on Kathleen Grundy. The altered medical records. And testimony from families who had lost loved ones under his care. But what made the trial even more chilling was Shipman himself. Shipman's cold, emotionless demeanor. Throughout the trial, Shipman sat in the courtroom like a statue. No tears. No remorse. No explanations. He refused to take the stand. He showed no emotion as family members wept before him, as they begged for answers. When confronted with the evidence, he had only one response. I did nothing wrong. The families demand justice. For the victims' families, the trial was agonizing. They had spent years believing that their loved ones had died of natural causes, only to learn they had been murdered. Some collapsed in court, sobbing. Others stared at Shipman in pure rage. One grieving son said, "He sat in our home. He looked us in the eye. He told us my mother died peacefully. And all along, he was the one who killed her." The weight of the horror was unbearable. And then, finally, justice arrived. The verdict, life in prison. On January 31, 2000, the jury returned its verdict. Harold Shipman was found guilty on all counts. 15 counts of murder. 1 count of forgery. Life imprisonment with no chance of parole. Judge Forbes looked Shipman directly in the eye as he passed the sentence. You have betrayed the trust of your patients. You have abused your profession. And you will die behind bars. Shipman showed no reaction. No anger. No fear. Just the same cold, blank stare. But the story wasn't over. Because what happened next left the world in shock. The final investigation that revealed Shipman's true number of victims. The shocking way he spent his last days in prison. And the chilling, unexpected way his story ended. Stay tuned. Because even in captivity, Harold Shipman had one last secret to reveal. Harold Shipman was sentenced to life in prison without parole. A serial killer, exposed. A community, shaken. A nation, horrified. But for the families of his victims, there was no real closure. Yes, he was behind bars. But the full scale of his crimes? That truth would never fully be known. Because just 4 years into his sentence, Harold Shipman made one final move. A decision as cold and calculated as his murders. He would never stand trial for the rest of his crimes. He would never answer the families still demanding justice. Instead, he chose to silence himself. Forever. The suicide of Harold Shipman, January 13, 2004. It was a bitterly cold morning in Wakefield Prison. Guards were making their routine checks when they reached cell A7. Inside, they found the lifeless body of Harold Shipman. He had used his bedsheets as a noose. His feet were still touching the ground. There was no struggle. No panic. Shipman had planned this meticulously, just as he had planned every one of his murders. He had chosen the day before his 58th birthday. And just like that, Britain's most prolific serial killer was gone. But for many, his death wasn't justice. It was an escape. Why did Shipman kill himself? Prison officials had no warning signs. He had never expressed suicidal thoughts. But then, when investigators looked closer, they found a chilling possibility. Because Shipman's suicide wasn't just about escaping prison. It may have been about money. Under UK law at the time, if a prisoner died before turning 60, their widow would still receive their pension. Shipman knew this. And he knew that by dying before his 60th birthday, his wife, Primrose, would get his full pension benefits. A lifetime of government payments. For a man who had spent decades controlling life and death. Even in his final moments, he was still in control. His last crime wasn't murder. It was manipulation from beyond the grave. The impact on his family, a wife who stood by him, and children who vanished. From the very beginning, Primrose Shipman had stood by her husband. Through the trial, through the accusations, through the horrifying revelations, she refused to believe he was guilty. Even as the evidence piled up, she remained loyal. She wrote him letters in prison. She visited him. She begged for his release. But after his suicide, something changed. Some reports suggest that she cut off contact with him before his death. That she had finally begun to accept the truth. As for Shipman's children, including his daughter, Sarah Shipman, they disappeared from public life. They had never spoken out about their father. And to this day, their whereabouts remain unknown. They had once been the family of a respected doctor. Now, they were the family of one of history's most prolific serial killers. And they wanted nothing to do with his legacy. How was he allowed to kill for so long? Shipman's death closed his case. But it didn't close the wounds he left behind. Because the question still haunted everyone. How did he get away with it? For over 20 years, he had been hiding in plain sight. How? The answer was a horrifying failure at every level of the system. Hospitals ignored the warning signs. Shipman had been caught forging prescriptions for powerful opioids back in 1975. He had been forced to leave his job, but was never banned from practicing medicine. Instead of being punished, he was given a second chance. That second chance cost hundreds of lives. Police failed to act in time. Shipman's crimes forced the UK government to act. After his conviction, a full public inquiry was launched. And the findings were devastating. The final estimate of Shipman's victims? Between 215 and 250 people. Some experts believe it could be even higher, closer to 450. In response, the UK completely overhauled its medical system. Doctors could no longer sign their own patients' death certificates. Prescription monitoring was tightened. Cremation approvals required more oversight. The changes were meant to prevent another doctor death from ever emerging again. But for the families who had already lost their loved ones, it was too little, too late. The legacy of Harold Shipman, a monster who stole more than just lives. Shipman didn't just kill his victims. He robbed them of dignity. He stole the final moments families should have had with them. And in the end, he stole justice from those left behind. His death meant no full confession. No answers. And no closure. Even today, his name casts a shadow over the medical profession. Because he wasn't just a serial killer. He was a doctor. A man who was trusted. A man who should have saved lives, but instead, ended them. And the terrifying truth is this. He wasn't a monster in the shadows. He was a man in a white coat. And no one suspected a thing. Final words, a warning that still echoes. If history has taught us anything, it's that evil doesn't always look like evil. Sometimes, it wears a smile. Sometimes, it holds a stethoscope. And sometimes, it's the person you trust most. Fade to black. Eerie, slow music fades out. End of documentary. Would you like a post-credit segment discussing theories, final thoughts, or a message to the audience? 5. Call to action, final minutes, boost engagement and discussion. Harold Shipman may be gone, but the questions he left behind still haunt us. How many victims were never discovered? Could someone like him slip through the system again? And most importantly, how do we stop this from ever happening again? What do you think? Do you believe Shipman's true victim count is much higher than 250? Should medical professionals face stricter monitoring to prevent another serial killer in the profession? Let's talk about it. Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if you want more in-depth true crime stories like this, make sure to white heavy checkmark subscribe for more deep dive true crime documentaries. White heavy checkmark like and share to spread awareness about this shocking case. White heavy checkmark turn on notifications so you never miss a case that needs to be told. Because in the world of true crime, the truth is never as simple as it seems.